Whittward Carver presents Inspector Whitt and the Great Bake-Off Blunder. Inspector Whitt was having a day that was more off-kilter than a tipsy waiter. His coffee was cold, his computer was kaput, and his favourite tie had a dodgy stain that looked suspiciously like marmalade. The pièce de résistance. He'd been assigned to investigate a series of peculiar incidents at the local bake-off. Whitt stood in the station, gawking at the incident board. Baking blunders? Really? I've chased crooks through London's eerie fog, and now I'm hunting down deflated soufflés. His sergeant, a man with a face like a well-used dishcloth, shrugged. Orders are orders, sir. The public's in a right state about their ruined Battenbergs. Whitt sighed. Fine. Let's nab this pastry perpetrator. He decided to go incognito. Disguised as a contestant, Whitt entered the bake-off, equipped with his grand's recipe for lemon drizzle cake. The community hall buzzed with activity, filled with the sweet aroma of sugar and the anxious chatter of contestants. Mrs. Johnson, rolling pin in hand and a determined expression, was already kneading her dough like a woman possessed. Mr. Jenkins, the retired postman, was carefully measuring his ingredients, hands shaking slightly with concentration. Whitt took his place at a nearby station, trying to blend in. He'd barely started creaming his butter and sugar when the first catastrophe struck. Mrs. Higginbotham, famed for her award-winning scones, let out a scream. Her mixing bowl was a bubbling black mess. "My scones!" she cried. "They're ruined!" Whitt raised an eyebrow, jotting down notes in his hidden notebook. This was no ordinary baking blooper. Something fishy was afoot. He turned back to his own mixture, only to find it had transformed into a lumpy, grey goop. He stared, flummoxed. Panic swept through the hall as one by one, the contestants' creations turned into culinary calamities. Whitt watched, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a familiar figure darting between the tables. Old Mrs. Johnson, with a twinkle of mischief in her eye. He cornered her by the jam tarts, her hands streaked with suspicious smudges of flour and food colouring. "Mrs. J," he said, his voice low. "A word, if you please." She chuckled, not at all flustered. "Sometimes I just fancy a change of scenery from Ahmed's fish and chips, Inspector. Thought I'd stir things up a bit." Whitt stared, then laughed. "Only in bloody London would Granny's baking sabotage be the highlight of my week." Back at the station, Whitt plopped his ruined lemon drizzle onto the sergeant's desk. "Case closed. I'm going home to drown my sorrows in a cuppa and forget this ever happened." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Nuff said, Inspector. Nuff said." But the story didn't end there. A few days later, Whitt received a package. Inside was a note. "Sorry about the mess, Inspector. Here's a little something to make amends, Mrs. J." A beautifully baked lemon drizzle cake sat nestled in the box, its golden crust shimmering with sugar. Whitt laughed, shaking his head. Only in blasted London would I end up with a rogue baker as a chum. Just then, P.C. Bailey barged in, panting. "Sir, we've got another one. Someone's been stealing garden gnomes from the posh neighbourhoods." Whitt sighed, grabbing his coat. "Here we go again. Maybe it's Mrs. J, branching out into garden ornaments." And so, life in London carried on, filled with its delightful mix of the mundane and the utterly bonkers.